Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar, which is the fourth in the Ultimate Logic Apps Best Practices Guide series on DevOps and Deployment, presented to you by Microsoft and 345 Technology. I have, in terms of the series, the first one we did, we looked at performance. Then we looked at operations, monitoring, diagnostics, that sort of thing. Then we looked at security. And now we're going to look at DevOps and deployment. So if you want to see those, the previous episodes in the series, they're available on our YouTube channel. Look for 345 Technology on YouTube, and you'll find those previous episodes on there. And today we're going to launch into DevOps and deployment. So our speakers, so as usual, you've got me, Andrew Rivers. I'm a founder and CEO of 345 Technology. And I'm joined by Dave Phelps, who is a senior cloud solution architect for Microsoft, but specializing in the whole integration technology stack. So, Dave, welcome. How are you doing today?
Doing very well, thank you. Enjoying the sunshine for once.
Yeah. What's been the biggest kind of, the biggest sort of technology things you've had to look at recently?
Oh, good question. I think AI obviously is everywhere, and we're beginning to see AI be used more and more within integration. And by that, I don't necessarily mean using AI services or stitching them together with integration, but also using AI to build integration with things like mapping and creating policies and API management, and Logic Apps now has a co-pilot as well. So I think that's probably the area that has kind of got most focus right now.
Yeah, it's kind of the new frontier, isn't it? So I think over the next, well, you can't get away from AI at the moment, but it's only going to get bigger, isn't it? There's only one direction to travel there.
For sure.
So I think maybe, I don't know if it's going to be next episode or maybe 2025, but we can start to cover some of that stuff off. I think that's a really kind of rich area of content. But please do let us know what you'd like to see up and coming, because we've been focusing really on Logic Apps, but we're starting to get to the end of Logic Apps, and maybe in the future we'll look at some we'll look at some other things. So let us know in the comments what you want to focus on. So here's a QR code, by the way. Please join us at Slido. If you scan that QR code, what you can then do is you can then take part in the online polls. You can add comments to us on Slido, but please do scan that and then take part in the presentation as it goes on. So what we're going to cover today is we're going to talk about DevOps really as a whole thing. Now, a lot of this is not, we're not going to go to right down to the nitty gritty. So if you're a technology decision maker, or you're an architect, it's probably a level pitched for you. There will be, I think it's also relevant for people that are hands-on developing as well, but we're not really going to cover too much of actually how to do DevOps. It's very much more about how this works and what's coming up, and also some of the tooling aspects of it. So we're going to look at generally DevOps practices, a little bit about security. We're going to cover a lot about deployment, and then we're going to cover a little bit of automate testing, and then hopefully have time to do some Q&A. So we've actually got a stacked amount of work to get through. So I'm going to crack on and just get this started, and then we'll get onto the demos as quickly as possible, because really seeing this stuff working is what I think is going to be really the really interesting part of it. And just don't forget that if you need to quickly build your Azure landing zones, we've got a ready-made out-of-the-box shrink-wrapped footprint for Azure Integration services called 345 Air. So 2 weeks planning, 2 weeks deployment, you can have a full footprint for Azure Integration, or as infrastructure as code out of the box. So next time you're planning a project, why not accelerate it? Okay, look at DevOps. We've all heard about DevOps, probably, and we're just going to start back and very, very quickly cover some of the foundations, really. So, why are we even talking about DevOps? So DevOps, really, the name originally comes from the combination of development and operations, and that is because people started to realize that if they used code for operational tasks, such as provisioning infrastructure, desired state configuration and releasing applications, that had a load of benefits because you're automating those build, test, and release processes. And what we've found is that it's a key driver for solution quality, because what we're doing is we're removing manual steps, because manual steps are not repeatable. And if you haven't got repeatability, you cannot have quality. You cannot have consistent quality. So, but not only do we achieve quality through repeatability and automation, but also it allows the developers to focus on adding value, on what features should be, how to actually improve your business, improve your lives, rather than focusing on just that repetitive work of doing deployments and releasing and testing and that sort of thing. It allows us to focus on adding value, and that's really what what the important things are. So, and one of the things I'm quite interested in, just with the audience we've got here, if you could, if you're already on Slido, please take part in the poll or scan that QR code there. But what is your DevOps tool chain of choice? So let's see what I'm going to put my one in now. And that hasn't changed anything at all. Everyone so far has put Azure DevOps. We keep getting more and more replies on this, and they're all saying Azure DevOps. Oh, hang on, we've got some GitHubs coming in. So I mean, it's in many ways GitHub's doing a late surge. So let's just give a couple more minutes to see where this ends up. But we look like we're having a majority on Azure DevOps, quite a big, but quite a big presence on GitHub as well. So thanks very much for those entries. Keep them coming. Oh, Azure DevOps pulling ahead at the end of the race there. So very interesting that in terms of this, we've actually got a lot of people in Azure DevOps, about a fifth of you on GitHub, but no one's using some of the other big vendors for their tool chain. Certainly not on this call. And I think this is very much, we're very much in the Microsoft camp here, so it's not really a surprise that the two products that are owned by Microsoft are where everyone's hanging out. So, but despite whether you're on Azure DevOps or whether you're on GitHub, the content here is absolutely relevant for you. Okay, so we're going to look at some of the practices that underpin DevOps. So even though when we talk about some of the stuff later, we'll assume that you're doing some of these practices. So the first thing is, it's just really to just branching. It's amazing how many customers that we talk to that still struggle with branching, even though it is a thing that has been solved. So, if you're using Azure DevOps, GitHub is obviously Git, but Azure DevOps, you get a choice, but we always recommend to use Git. And the thing is that getting your branching strategy is right, because it allows you to develop new features whilst at the same time supporting production. So the diagram on the right is for Git flow. So with Git flow, your master branch is what is actually your released code. And as you can see from the diagram, you can go in left to right is time, and you can do hot fixes on that. So it allows you to do hot fixes, but at the same time, you can be developing new features, preparing new releases, and then promoting those releases. And allows you to do that work in parallel. Because one of the areas where we find people just get themselves in a pickle all the time is how do you support production and at the same time do new releases. So, integration as well. Generally, we often schedule releases with certain business change, because there's often a wider business process change going on. So if you're doing that, Git Flow is great for scheduling releases. But there is a simplified version of this called GitHub Flow, where if you're in a more of a continuous release, small team, want less overhead, then you can also have a look at GitHub Flow. Just do a search for it. It's a cut down version of the diagram we've got there on the right. But please do choose a branching strategy, learn how to use it, get your developers to use it, because it will save you so much time later to get that right. The next thing we're going to look at is really the controls, because we talked about DevOps improving quality, but what does that actually mean? So one of the things we can do is we can protect our key branch, what we call the trunk branches. So your master branch, or your main branch as it's often called, and sometimes your develop branch or your release branches. You can make sure that you're only allowed to get code into those if it has passed tests and if it builds successfully. So what you can do is every time you push code to a remote branch, you can kick off. Obviously, you kick off a compilation, so you build that, and then you can unit test it, and you can check the code coverage on that. And only if those things are good and your build is successful and it goes green, only then are you able to put that into some of those protected branches. The other thing we always recommend is that you do that via pull requests rather than directly pushing to any of your trunk branches, because this helps you put in those sort of controls. So really just you're making sure that all that code is clean, those key branches are protected. And the other thing is that, well, we're going to talk a little bit about automated testing later, because up until now, integration has been something that's been quite hard to do unit testing of, that sometimes we actually have to deploy into an integration environment and then run automated tests in there. And that might be part of our release cycle rather than our continuous integration, our CI cycle. And finally, just you can put in deployment gates, so you can make sure that you can only release. So as part of your continuous delivery, your release pipeline, you can make sure that you can only release if you've passed those integration tests, and also you've got the ability to have you can actually have manual approval or scheduled approval, so that those releases can only go in not only when the code's good, but also when you say so, to prevent inadvertent releases. So there's a whole load of controls that you should be putting in as best practices. If you want any help on that, by all means reach out to me, and I'm happy to have a chat on that. But now we're going to talk about a big part of this is the deployment side, and look at deployment. So this webinar is towards logic apps, and it's probably useful at this point to call out the differences between consumption and standard. So what we're going to talk about mostly is aimed at logic app standard, which is it's the new logic apps. It's where it's where most of the investment's going. Consumption logic apps, they're the older way of doing logic apps. Those are the first logic apps out there, and you deploy those via an ARM template. And when you deploy the ARM template, it creates all the infrastructure behind it in the background, and it's all together. So your workflow and all that infrastructure is all deployed together, and you don't really see it. And so it's a fully serverless service. So by default, that will run on shared compute, and because it's ARM templates, you can parameterize them. So you actually you use the portal designer. You can export that as an ARM template, but then you can parameterize that so that you can stage that between environments. So that's just a bit of a nod to consumption, but what we're really going to talk about mostly today is logic app standard, and those are deployed onto hosting plans, which is dedicated compute, and that deployment happens via the data plane. So again, you've got the management plane for actually managing things in Azure, but you've got the data plane, which is where so for databases, that's where the data lives, and so that has you can secure those separately. And so you can't see the data plane from the Azure portal necessarily, but you can. But if things are in a private network, so if you're in a private network, you have to go by the data plane. But workflows can be deployed independently from the infrastructure, from the Logic App infrastructure, because we've got the hosting plan. We put the infrastructure in first, and then we deploy our workflows into that. So just looking at the security a little bit, please remember that your DevOps tool chain is an attack surface, and once you're aware of that, you can make sure that's secure. And that's because Azure DevOps and GitHub are hosted outside your perimeter, and so what you don't want to do is then open up holes into your perimeter security for DevOps that other people can exploit. So just some things to think about, that if your DevOps hosting agent is inside your perimeter connecting out to get the code, then it's in a secure place. Just for segregation, it's great for developers to have development accounts that don't have any accounts, separate deployments, or use some of the tools in Azure to get privileges added for a limited period of time. You're not actually an elevation of privilege into deployment. And just generally, what I like to say is don't give developers any permission to change anything in production, because anything in production should always be going via your DevOps pipeline. Your developers might be there to support and to see what's happening, but not to make any changes. Make sure the changes go back through your DevOps process. So, and just an illustration of this thing about the DevOps agents. If you've got your secure cloud network there on the right, and your Azure DevOps tenant is outside that, then what we do is we recommend you put your Azure DevOps agent inside your network, and we usually host that on a VM scale set, but it can be on container apps now. But the key thing is that agent will then connect outwards, so it'll make an outbound connection. So there isn't an inbound connection to exploit, and then that can deploy both your hosting plan, your Logic Apps infrastructure, but it can also then deploy your workflows that go with that. Okay, the next thing I'm going to touch on very briefly is release strategies, because what we want to make sure of is that when we actually do releases, we have the minimum impact. So the ideal thing is to have zero downtime, and until recently, this was quite difficult to do with Logic Apps per se, and we're going to talk a lot about that over this presentation. But the diagram here shows blue-green, and that's where you stand up a new set of infrastructure to host your application on, and then you route between them. And that's how traditionally we've done zero downtime deployments for Logic Apps. Is actually that whole thing of having separate infrastructure, deploying your new application onto the new infrastructure, and then routing between them. But you can also have canary deployments, and sometimes some technologies make this easier than others. But canary is where you can actually have a small proportion of your traffic on your new application, where you can test it, make sure it's all right, and then you can get the rest of the traffic over. And a very similar version of that is A/B testing, where you route portions of your between different, so you can actually feedback on which ones perform better, usually for feature testing. So for Logic Apps, though, really mostly we're looking at zero downtime and blue-green, because integration generally isn't that kind of that customer-facing thing where you actually want to see how people interact with the software. So again, deploying Logic App standard. If you've got a hosting plan, you can deploy multiple Logic Apps onto that, and the workflows sit within that. And when you've got a a solution of Visual Studio Code, that's a Logic app with multiple workflows, and that's a unit of deployment. So as we go through this, we'll just assume that a bunch of workflows collected together as a Logic app is a unit of deployment, and that'll actually make the context of this. But in all of this, that hosting plan can have multiple, can be hosting multiple Logic apps. So a big part of what we're going to talk about today is the concept of deployment slots. And so given the goal is to achieve a zero downtime deployment, that at the moment, if up till now with Logic apps standard, if you deploy a new version over the top of a Logic app, it becomes unavailable while the deployment is happening. And deployment slots are the answer, because it means you can actually create a pre-prod deployment slot. You can deploy your code, and then you swap your pre-prod code to be your live code. Your live code swaps then to be your pre-prod code because it's a swap, and then it supports failback because you can then swap them back again. And so some things where you actually need to cause apps to restart, such as updating their settings, you can use it for that, so that you don't actually have that restart and loss of service at all. So this is a great new feature that's coming into the hosting plan, and it's currently in preview. Dave, do you know when deployment slots are going to be in GA?
I don't, but I can find out and we can post an update.
Yeah, definitely do that. Right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk about how deployment slots work, and then I'm going to shut up and hand over to Dave, who's actually going to do a demo on this. So at the moment, like I say, what you'd have now is you've got if you've got your Logic app code, and that's within its Logic app infrastructure, and it's all running and it's live, but you actually want to do a deployment. What you're effectively doing is you're tearing down your current Logic app, and then you lose your application temporarily while you put your new Logic app in, and then, hey presto, you've then got service again. And so, for some of you that might be okay. You can deploy out of hours. It's really easy, no one cares. But actually, if you've got customer-facing services that have to be available all the time, you want to make sure that you've got zero downtime deployment, because you want to maintain that service. So when we use deployment slots, we actually take a slightly different approach to this. So what we do is, if you've got your deployment slot there, your production deployment slot, your code's running in that, what we do is, in parallel to that, we create another deployment slot that's a non-production one. We deploy our next version of the Logic app into that, and then we can actually do some validation checks on that. We can make sure it deploys and it has some measure of sort of success with deployment, that it's configured correctly and that sort of thing. What we can't do is actually run it. And then what we can do after that is we can do the swap. So so effectively, the production slot moves over. We move our live, and we move our live routing to the new Logic app, and then we're done. And we've done that without any loss of service. And that's a really, 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 really good thing to do, because these are really easy to use. When you do blue-green and you've got to stand up new infrastructure, deploy that code onto the new infrastructure, then have some way of routing between those separate bits of infrastructure. From a DevOps perspective, that's actually quite hard. But the actual process here of doing deployment slots, by comparison, it's really easy, because it's all within the same infrastructure. I mean, there are some limitations. So the thing is, the non-production slots are read-only. They don't execute. They don't get traffic routed to them. So you can't actually, so they only support switchover. So they don't do blue-green, which would be separate infrastructure. They can't allow you to do product verification or smoke test it before it goes live. and it doesn't allow you to route certain proportions of your traffic to each of those. Now, if you use deployment slots on Azure Functions, some of those features like canary deployments and A/B testing are coming into Azure Functions, but they're not available at the moment in Logic Apps. But definitely the ability to do zero downtime is a really powerful thing. So, Dave, I'll hand over to you to show everyone how this works.
Okay, right, so we'll share my screen. Hopefully you can see that okay?
Yep.
Yep, okay. So deployment slots. Just to clarify one thing, when you do a deployment, all it means is that the existing workflows, if you had something that were HTTP triggered, for example, then that may not be available during the deployment. But if you have existing workflows that are running, that could be long running, for example, they continue to run, so that there's no kind of no unavailability there. So what I'm going to show here is what happens if we call our endpoint. So this is working. It's working fine. It's an HTTP based trigger. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to deploy my workflow, my Logic app. And I would deploy to I've already created a slot, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second. But I'm going to show you what happens at runtime. So here we are. We're doing a deployment. Clicking my send button. It's all working fine. Then it takes a bit longer.
Now it's thinking about it.
So it's kind of unavailable right now. Only for a few seconds. It's not long. We just wait for this to come back. There we go. So that is now working. But you saw that there is a brief period where it wasn't receiving my HTTP requests. So what we can do is we can create a deployment slot, and as Andrew said, we can deploy the Logic app to that deployment slot. So if we just jump back in here, and this is my Logic app, and what I've got here is a couple of I've got a production slot, and I've also created this staging slot. So what I can do is I can go and make a change to my workflow, and maybe I want to go and add, this is my fictitious travel application, and I'm going to put travel date in here. Maybe I'm doing that on the 1st of November 2024. Make sure it's valid. Yep. So what I'm going to do is save that. Yeah. I'm going to save that. Now, what I can do, and this is a new feature in Visual Studio Code, is that I can do a deployment to a slot. And so you saw that I created my prepod slot earlier. So if we just go and do a deployment, it should come up and ask me which slot I would like to deploy to. In a second. Okay. Obviously, I'm doing this completely live, so hopefully the demo gods are with me. So I will pick my staging slot, and that is now going to go and do a deployment. So if we jump back here, and we click send, then I'm hoping we won't see any kind of outage here. So it should only take 20 seconds or so.
Well, there's a couple of things to look out for because you've actually changed your app so that response is going to be different.
Yeah.
So not only are we seeing that we've actually got no interruption of service, but actually that new code hasn't actually gone live yet.
So we did our deployment, and unlike the first time, we didn't have any downtime at all. So what I can now do is I can do a swap between, well, in fact, the first thing I can do is I can go to my staging slot, and you can see here that it's essentially a replica of the production infrastructure. I have my workflows here. So what I can do is I can come in here and validate them. So I can go and take a look at my check status. And if I just jump into the designer, then we're hoping we'll see my excuse me, my travel date there. I've also got some connections in here. Hopefully they are there, so they're valid. So I can come and do this validation of my deployment before actually then decide to do a swap operation. So what I'm going to do now is do a swap between my staging and my production. Now it may be that some of the app variables have changed or are different. I've got a chance here to go and set them when I do a swap, but I'm just going to initiate the swap here. And if I jump back to my trusty postman call here, I'm calling check status. Now it does take around a minute or so for this to complete, but I would just keep pressing the send button. And what I'm expecting here is we'll see that date appear here, and we don't have any downtime.
I think one thing it's worth pointing out while we're doing this is that some of the commands, you can use the command line to do the swaps, and you can use Visual Studio Code, but it's not available in the portal right now. Well, there we go. We've got the new response coming through.
Yeah, so and that's really cool because that means that we were able to deploy to our pre-prod slot. We were able to go into the Logic app. We were able to check it out, able to validate it, make sure we were comfortable with that, and then we could do that slot swap. And as you saw, the service just carried on working, and then we saw the updated code get deployed there. So I think it's a really, really cool feature. And the other thing that Andrew mentioned earlier is, I think, a really key point, that if you go and update any settings, and by that I mean the kind of environment variables, the application settings, that restarts the app. Whereas if you make those changes in your pre-prod slot and then you do a swap, then again that doesn't restart the app, so that you get that zero downtime. So I think that was all I wanted to show on deployment slots. That was everything, wasn't it, Andrew?
I think it was. So what I'm going to do now, Dave, I'll let you get your next thing together, because so the next thing we're going to look at is some of the tooling around creating deployments and parameterizing things. So not to do death by PowerPoint, otherwise known as I haven't written any slides for this. Can we let's just set the scene a little bit for what we're going to do in this next part. So let's talk about parameterizing connections first, and why is it that that's important, and what problem are we solving by doing that? Dave?
Sorry. Yeah, so I'm just going to switch back again.
Yeah, sure.
Just show everyone what's going on here. So from a connections perspective, in Logic apps, we have two types of connection. And you can see those in connections.json. We have managed API connections, we have service provider connections. And the difference is that the managed API connections are the ones that are they're managed by Azure. They're things like I've got here. It's Outlook, Office 365, and there's hundreds of these things, but they are the managed connectors. We also have these called service provider connections, which are what we call built-in. So they run as part of the Azure Logic Apps runtime. So it's not hosted kind of outside of the Logic App. And from a parameterization perspective, we need to make sure that we aren't hard coding any of these values in here, that we've actually got them configured inside our settings, which, as we saw earlier, they turn up as those application settings in the Logic App. So really important that we parameterize these settings so that you can change them in the settings of the Logic App, and if you need to change them, you're not having to redeploy your code. So really important to parameterize them. If you got more, you're continuing to show some slides, aren't you, Andrew? Before I go on.
No.
No. Okay. Cool.
No.
Excellent. So we've got all of these settings, and what you can see here, if people are familiar with connections.json, we've now got app settings in here, and what's important here is that until this latest update, and this is a preview, and we can share some links so that you can go and check this out after. These weren't parameterized, so you had to kind of do some work at deployment time, and I guess people have probably done this in order to change some of these settings. And I think the really key one here are the managed connectors, because this authentication here, if you use connectors from Azure, which is this setting, it's in here somewhere, but you can say use connectors from Azure, and then from your Visual Studio Code, you can then go and use the Outlook connector, like I've done here. But what it does locally is it uses a value which is a kind of connection key, and this is so you can access it through Visual Studio Code. Yet when you deploy your Logic App, the Logic App is going to use managed identity to go and connect to the to that managed connector. But obviously it's running locally, it doesn't have managed identity, so that's why it uses this key. But previously you would have seen that key referenced in here, and you would have had to do a bit of work in order to kind of manipulate connections.json when it's deployed using your pipeline. So with this fix or update, what we see is that we're using parameters. Now you're seeing a mix of app settings and parameters here. The reason is that app settings are single values, whereas with Logic Apps parameters, they can be something more complex, like the authentication here. So when we deploy this, we would change this value to say managed identity or managed service identity, so that when it's deployed, it's using managed identity to go and connect to the connector. So this update is really, really good. So all of the settings that need to be parameterized can be, such as the subscription, where the connection is, and its location. And as I said, the important thing are the parameters that allow you to set those runtime authentication parameters that previously wasn't so easy to do. And the next thing that we can do here, and again, this is a new feature, there's this generate deployment scripts option here. And if I just select that, I won't go all the way through. I did it earlier when I showed the outcome. but it allows you to select your subscription and the resource group, the logic app, all the things that you would need, and it will then go and set them for you. And it creates this kind of folder called deployment. And in here, we can see we've got pipelines, we've got infrastructure, and we have workflow parameters. Now, if we start at the infrastructure, now what it's done here is created, this is an ARM template, and it's created this ARM template to go and create all of the infrastructure related to your logic app, which is the plan, the logic app itself. Now, this is for the preview, it's in ARM only, but the product group are working on this, and we should see Bicep available around the end of the year. So you'll be able to choose whether you want ARM or Bicep. So what we're doing here is creating essentially the infrastructure that lets you go and create that logic app upfront. And this is one of the key differences, as Andrew said earlier, between consumption logic apps and standard, because with consumption, there's a one-to-one relationship between a workflow and the logic app itself. Whereas in logic app standard, it's a one-to-many relationship. So one logic app can have many workflows. So you can go ahead and create all of your infra, then have a separate process that is going to just deploy the workflows. And so if we take a look at the pipeline that it's created here, we have the CI pipeline, which all that's doing is generating the zip deploy. And this is Azure DevOps that it's creating here. But we create the zip, and then if we look at the deployment pipeline, we have this new task called Azure Logic App Standard. And there's a few of these that are available in Azure DevOps today. But what this is going to do is just deploy the zip file that was created that contains your workflow definitions and related artifacts. And it's going to then deploy to your infrastructure in Azure. So right from Visual Studio Code, we now have this great option of being able to create all of our scripts and just have them in our repo and just do our deployments. And I mentioned earlier about the connections.json, and I was talking about this authentication value, which is a complex type, which looks like this. So if we go and take a look at what's happened up here, we can see in our parameters.json that it's now changed to say managed service identity. And this is what I was talking about, that when we do a deployment, the only thing that we're changing is the parameters.json and also the local.settings.json, so that you don't have to anymore manipulate the connections.json at runtime. So I think this is really a really useful feature, and I think it's really going to help a lot of developers in their logic apps deployments. And I think that was all I was going to show. We will share a link that talks about this and goes into more detail, and there's a walkthrough as well that tells you how to kind of go from creating the scripts in here and then putting them into Azure DevOps and actually doing a deployment. So we'll share that after. But yeah, that's all I wanted to show for now.
Yeah, great stuff. Thanks, Dave. And the significance of this really being that previously a lot of this stuff you had to handcraft it. It was just extra. It was just extra work that had to be done. It was like extra tax on top of your project that was actually being done. Whereas now the tooling there is actually getting you to the point of developing. Because DevOps is a good thing, but it's hard work. And so what we're actually doing is making that DevOps thing easier, so that we can actually put in those good practices and make that less of a tax on your project, because a lot of people often find that, oh yeah, I want to pay for writing the code, but I don't want to pay for the DevOps, and it's a false economy. but actually, the more that we can make that actually doing it properly, actually not take an awful lot of time, the happier everyone is. It's just really good practice, and something that we should really be just doing by default. Okay, one of the things I'm going to do now is just I'm going to add my last thing, because this is the last thing we're really going to talk about, is a little bit about automated testing. So again, just setting the scene, there are, integration has always been a hard thing to unit test because often it's long running processes. Then it's not just end-to-end path through some code. So I'm clicking on the wrong thing. I'm trying to get the slide to move forward, and I'm clicking on the wrong screen. So, Dave, should we just talk a little bit about what we're doing with the automate testing on Logic App Standard, and what's available now, what's up and coming. So, do you want to just sort of take us through this?
Yeah, yeah, sure. So, I guess for today, automated testing is really something that you have to do against a deployed resource. You don't have to. You can run the Logic app in part of your pipeline, but typically with the different services that you might be connecting to, and because they're live connections, then you are typically testing against live resources. And what we really want to do is to be able to test our Logic app, and that's really what we're testing, isn't it? It's not the fact that from a unit test perspective, it's not that we want to validate that some external system is running or not. We want to make sure that the logic we have inside our workflow is actually correct, because we could have decisions in there, we could have mappings in there, etc. So what the goal is for the automated testing is to be able to externalize that testing from the workflow, and to be able to mock the actions that we may have inside a Logic app. If I'm calling out to some kind of endpoint and pulling a value back, what I really want to be able to do is to execute a set of tests that would say, if that external service were to return with these specific values, then that's correct. Or maybe if I pass in a particular request, I expect a particular response to come back. And this is really the focus that the product group are making at the moment. They're really focused on providing a testing framework that would allow you to create tests, and also, as it says there, do some create that mocking, the mocks from your Logic app, so that you don't have to then hit a real live resource. What you can do is mock it. And we have static results today, which allow you to do that to an extent, but that does alter the workflow definition. So what we want to do here is to not do that and to externalize that from the Logic app. Excuse me, I've got a frog in my throat. So so that's really where this is going, and I think we're targeting a private preview sometime around the end of the year. So if you're interested in that, then let us know, and be happy to get you involved in that. One thing I would say is that today we were talking right at the beginning about using AI, and I don't know if anyone's ever used GitHub Copilot, but Copilot does a really good job of creating unit tests for you. And I'm just going to go and present my screen again, actually, if that's okay, Andrew.
Yeah, sure.
And I would just do entire screen and jump back here. Can you see my screen here? Hopefully. Is it? I need to click share, that's why. There we go. So I was just playing around with this earlier on. So what I can do is if I go into GitHub Copilot here, and if I paste in create a unit test in the C# to call an HTTP REST service with the following payload, and check the JSON response contains a field called order ID. Now this isn't unique to Logic Apps, you could do this for any service, but if you've got your Logic App deployed, then hopefully this is going to create something that's kind of doing the job. So yeah, check this out. So it's calling, got the endpoint configured, it's going calling it, and it's then validating that the response contains the value that I want. Now, of course, you could do this with service bus or any kind of trigger that your Logic App may have. You might want your test to go and kind of send a message and then validate the response comes back. So today, these are the kind of options, and we would still be doing something similar later on, but the difference would be that the Logic App would have mocked actions so that you wouldn't have to have that live resource up and running. So yeah, I'm really excited with what the product group are doing in this area, and watch this space for updates over the coming months.
Great stuff. Thanks, Dave. So I think we're just at the we're coming to the end of our webinar now. Main takeaways being that DevOps is essential for repeatability and quality. It's not, there is investment, but it pays off. It pays off in quality later. Deployment slots are making it easier to do zero downtime deployments, and that's and that's a really good thing for the availability of your live applications. There's a lot of improvements in Visual Studio Code to make it easier to stage and deploy Logic Apps. And then there's a lot of improvements coming in the future to support better automated testing, so that we can actually move a lot more of that testing into the CI/CD process, and rely less on having to test before the code. And that's going to make the whole development cycle faster and cheaper, and so there's a good benefit for you there. Okay, so lastly, please, again, if you've still got Slido up, please sum up your thoughts on the webinar in 1 or 2 words. We'd love to hear what your thoughts are. Well, that was a bit of a tumbleweed moment. Some people are typing. Don't be shy. We don't know who said what. Well, thank you so. Thank you. Please carry on. Moment. Yes.
Andrew,
while this is going.
I think your headphones are breaking up. I don't know if you can switch to your laptop microphone.
How is that?
That's better. Yeah, there's a lot of wrestling.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on there.
Oh, it's still there.
I think what's actually happening is, I think it's actually using my laptop. But, in the rest of it, it's probably using my laptop.
Yeah, we can't hear you very well.
Can you hear me at all? Then?
Yeah, we can just about.
Okay, maybe I've just made it even worse by fiddling with the settings. But thank you so much, everyone. I can't see any questions in there, but we can do. We've got a little bit of time for questions if anyone's got any. So just give everyone a minute or so to put a question in. Well, on that note, what I'd like to do is thank everyone for attending the webinar today, and we will catch you on the next one. Okay, bye now.